men are from Mars and women are from Venus situation where women often want to be heard and men often want a solution. So then you end up with this hypothetical husband and wife where he's offering solutions, whereas she just wants to be heard, and neither of them are listening to one or another.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Okay.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast. I'm here with George of the TinMen, and I'm super excited for a fascinating conversation, so welcome.
Hello. Lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
So starting off, just tell us who you are, where you come from.
Well, my name's George. I come from the left. I live in London. I live in London's a very progressive part of quite a progressive country. And I used to live in Peckham, which was the most progressive part of the most progressive part of the most progressive part, like the Mordor of progressivism. And I guess I have always challenged popular thinking, which is not something you should be doing within progressivism, which doesn't make any sense, because I've always thought to be a progressive is by its very nature to be uncomfortable at all times, always to be questioning, always to be throwing stones, rocking the boat, challenging people, lying on the bed of nails in many ways. And one of the things, as a man, I always found the left's conversation around men seemed to be a little bit incomplete when I started to I remember walking back from work to my home and always being like, what I'm hearing from my so-called progressive friends doesn't line up with my lived experiences or the lived experiences of my other male friends. So then I started to question it, question the gospel of the left. And then that didn't go well. And then I would want my ideas to be substantiated by facts. So, I mean, I would have lunch with a lot of feminist organizations who are all about ending violence against women, or going into schools and talking to boys about toxic masculinity. And intuitively, it didn't feel right to me. But then I would go and I would look at the Office for National Statistics, who every year publish the UK data for England and Wales on domestic violence. And then I would look at the data, and then I would look at listen to the conversations, and then one didn't marry up with the other. So then I'd bring back the data to the conversations. At this point, I'd set up a page called the TinMen, which was just like a library of content for my own use to have literally beneath the table. So I could bring facts to these outrageous conversations. And I would say, I understand talking about violence against women, but if 1 in 3 victims of abuse is a man in England and Wales, then surely we should be talking about domestic violence as a whole. We don't exclude women from conversations where they're the minority. 1 in 5 homeless people in the UK is a woman, but we would never exclude them from the conversation. And yet domestic violence, obviously an even bigger portion, is men, and it's actually now close to 40% are men, and we don't talk about it. So that was obviously a concern. But then the bigger concern was the reaction I would receive, which was just, people shaking their fist in my face and shouting at me and calling me all sorts of silly names. So I was doubly intrigued, firstly by the issues that I was learning about at a breathtaking rate, all of them, like suicide, addiction, homelessness, domestic violence, sexual abuse, fatherlessness, workplace death, education, men's health. And then more intriguing in many ways was people's ignorance and often hostility to, you literally get finger in the face. Well, male victims of abuse are infinitesimally small. And I was like, there's 750,000 of them. That's a lot. And now it's 1.5 million in England and Wales. So I don't know what you mean by infinitesimal, but that sounds like a lot of people. So I guess, I wasn't put off by the anger. If anything, I was motivated by it. And I kept digging down into the rabbit hole of so-called men's rights. And then I started, I'm a filmmaker as well. That's my trade. I said I'm a filmmaker and a creative director, a studio that I own. And I've always built a career in communicating ideas for quite big brands. So I used to work for the World Economic Forum and Google and various universities and the NHS. And I'd built a career communicating things that are important. And I was like, these issues are so breathtaking. I feel like what it needs is someone like me to come along and rebrand them into something that is more accessible, but not apologetic, so I can bring more people on my journey. And that's what I've done 5 years ago. So now I'm here. This is during lockdown, so I had a lot of free time because filmmaking was more or less on pause. There was no filmmaking at the time. So I needed to just itch the creative urge, and that became the Tin Men. So many, many arguments later, I'm here.
The first thing that's so striking to me is, this idea of like you're questioning narratives, and the progressive idea is, well, you need to be open minded, you need to deconstruct and challenge all these ideas, except for all these ideas that we
Yeah.
have, and it's like you're challenging the
Yeah.
wrong ideas.
It's just like men should talk, but not about those things. Or, we want diversity of everything on the left, but just not diversity of ideas or points of view, which is the most important thing that you need. So it's amazing they present themselves as these moral guardians, but ultimately they're only guardians of the things that they find important to their ideological cause. And I still consider myself on the left, but sort of ashamed of myself and others around me, because I've always considered the left to be partly about social equality, and part of social equality is extending that to men. So if looking at boys, for example, in the UK, for my entire life, more than 35 years now, boys have been behind in education. No one knows about that. And like, one of my fundamental beliefs is that everyone is entitled to an equal education. Boys are not getting that. They're getting further and further behind. So why are boys not entitled to equality too? So I feel like I'm the most left because I actually am being consistent with my so-called leftist views.
It seems like this consistent double standard. Like if girls or women are behind in something, the system is bad and oppressive. If boys and men are behind in something, there's something wrong with boys and men.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when women were behind in education, if you go back 50 years, when women were behind, in America at least, I think they were 13 percentage points behind men, and we did change the system. Americans wrote Title IX. Richard Nixon wrote it to, in part, bring women's numbers up. That was in 1972, I think. And then in 1981, objective achieved 50-50. And then we kept on swinging the pendulum to the point where boys, young men in America, in higher education at least, they're now further behind girls than girls were. So the metaphorical pendulum swung even further to the other side, plus interest, where the problem is not solved, it's actually worse, just inverted. And you're very right, we don't want to change the system. Whenever I talk about boys' education, the response is so often thrown out as just, well, boys should work harder, or maybe girls are just smarter. I'm like, what are you talking about? So it's crazy we never said that, and we rightfully changed the system to bring women's numbers up in the 70s, but any suggestion of doing the same to correct an even bigger disparity against men and boys in education is not only not being done, but any suggestion of that will get you the finger in face that I often get. And it's just that's so intriguing for me. As a problem solver, I find it really intriguing that not only do these issues exist, but like I said, like we're absolutely allergic to reality, even though it's staring us right in the face.
Yeah, there's something about when I started asking a lot of male therapists about men's mental health and men's issues and stuff like that. And it started to be like an issue that I was like trying to carefully dance around, because if you say men's rights, in a lot of people's ears, what they immediately hear is misogyny. They don't even necessarily hear anything about men. It's just, why do you hate women? Do you find it difficult to navigate that type of minefield?
Yeah, I mean, I don't ascribe to the term of men's rights activism, only because it's just such a shit show. Like, it's just it's a handle with which someone can get hold of you, and then it's game over. You get blamed for everything. So, although I am sympathetic to men's rights, and I do think there are rights that men do lack in America. Like, you have like the draft, where men have to sign up to the draft and sign their body away. You have circumcision, where boys' genitals are violated at the first days of life. You have fathers' rights, of course. The right to equal protection is not afforded to men, because many of the victims of abuse I talk about have nowhere to go in America, unlike a lot of women. So I understand the concept of men's rights, but I talk more about just men's health now, because that ultimately is the common denominator. That's what I'm talking about, really, men's health, but a more holistic point of view. So I'll talk about sexual violence in men's prisons, which is a men's health issue, because obviously that has a massive impact on men's health. I'll talk about the things you talk about within therapy. I'll talk about education. I'll talk about drug addiction, suicide, I'll talk about men's actual physical health as well, sexual health, and then anything that has a detrimental impact onto men's health is relevant to me. And I use that term just because it's a little bit more palatable than men's rights. Uh, and that's Debbie here. I mean, you're right about therapy. I do talk about therapy. It's similar to education, where similar disparity of men versus women, where 80% of therapists are women, about 80% of teachers are also women. And what I'm pushing is that, does that lead to learning environments and therapeutic environments that are more suitable to boys learning, so girls learning and women's therapeutic needs? And I think there's a strong argument that it does. So at least part of the reason why boys are behind in education is because education is designed by women and for girls more often. Similarly, the reason why so few men go to therapy is because therapy is more suited to women's needs, because it's mostly women that are offering therapy. So these are conversations that are really interesting, and people desperately want to have them. And I'm trying to meet that sort of urge.
What
really.
about therapy do you think is feminized in a way that turns off men? And like, how could we improve that for men?
I don't think men sitting down in a clinical environment having a face-to-face conversation with normally a woman is what most men want. I think men prefer group therapy. I think they like to speak to other men on their level, not in a sort of clinical environment. They like some sort of physical activity. So we talk about shoulder to shoulder time rather than face to face time. One of the initiatives I really enjoyed seeing coming from Australia, but now in England and America, men's sheds. I don't know if you know about it, but it's essentially as described. It's these various sheds all over the country, which are workshops, and they're for all men, but particularly older men. And men go to these sheds and they build and fix things for local communities, and it gives men that sense of purpose and camaraderie and belonging and meaningfulness, and it has the added benefit of they're fixing like often toys for children. And that's had a massive benefit to men's health, men's mental health. And I think that's what they want. Like I've really enjoyed in the past few years seeing like a renaissance of what's called social prescription charities. So instead of like giving someone a pill, like an antidepressant, a man will be sent on to a dog walking group or an allotment or a men's shed or like a breakfast club or whatever it is. Like it could even be like reenacting Roman battles or walking around a field with a metal detector looking for Roman coins. These are things that I think have therapeutic value towards a lot of men, and we should be investigating them more rather than just writing up like pharmacological prescriptions. So I'm not one to tell you what men want, but I do think group therapy and these physical activities are a great start in finding out what that might be.
You know, one of the things that you consistently hear men who are suicidally depressed say, like the feeling of uselessness. I feel useless or worthless. And kind of it sounds
Mm-hmm.
like what you're saying is so much of this is connected to, can I do something productive, or can I feel some sense of like I'm meaningfully contributing? And kind of this,
Mm-hmm.
stereotypical feminized therapy where it's just like, I'm going to kind of take off the armor and like show you my vulnerabilities and show you even more how worthless I am. It almost seems to be going in the wrong direction.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I recently had to recarpet a small part of my flat, mainly because the dog shit all over it. And it took me all day, and it required a lot of swearing and grunting and a few injuries. But after I'd done it, the next few days walking over that little 2 or 3 square feet of carpet, I felt so good about myself, not just in immediately afterwards, but just I felt so great having achieved what seems to be a rather benign act. And I can see why a lot of people, not just men, but women too, but particularly men, do get a sense of happiness and well-being from being productive and seeing the products of that productivity. And I just think we should get on board with that. It's just sad that that sort of thing is often mocked. There was that meme a long time ago that would say, it would be like a photo of like men like reenacting a Roman battle, and it would say, "Oh, men would rather reenact Roman battles or pretend to go to war than go to therapy." Or no, there's one of some older men tinkering with some steam engines. Or men would rather build a steam engine and run it for free than go to therapy. Or men would rather start a band. Or men would rather go fly a kite. And I'm like, those things are, in many ways, therapeutic to those men. Like, you're missing the point. Like, if they're getting enjoyment and they're finishing these activities feeling better than how they felt when they started them, then is that not therapeutic? It certainly shouldn't be sneered at, and we should be championing them. And in many ways, seeing those men enacting Battle of Agincourt as the pioneers of mental health, in many ways, that to be learnt from. And I think a sense of productivity and belonging, purpose is essential to men's mental health. And that's just something you just don't get when you sit in a clinical environment and just talk about your
It seems
problems. Like, it's just like,
it seems like so much of the way that current clinical therapy, like the very feminized version of it, conceives of men is men are essentially defective women, and we need to teach them how to be more like women.
Yeah, well, this is an argument that I'm currently embroiled in on Twitter. Like, I had a little break and now I guess I'm back. But there's this conversation around male loneliness, which is a bit of a proxy for male suicide, men's mental health. But apparently the male loneliness epidemic isn't a male loneliness epidemic. It's a skills gap. It's a skills gap. Men don't have the skills to talk about their feelings. This is a self-inflicted problem. And it's, of course, it's down to men to solve themselves. But what I think that conversation misses is that the skills we're teaching men, i.e. talking to each other, maybe those skills aren't what's best for men. Maybe we need to find a new set of skills. Maybe the skills that we keep insisting that men learn are not the right ones. Maybe they're right for women, but not for men. Maybe we should be teaching them how to armor up and fight a Roman battle, or make their steam engines, or walk their dogs, or whatever else it is, go to allotment, blah, 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 blah. But we always insist that men are the ones that are wrong. And yet that might not be the case. And it's, again, like, it's frustrating to be on the left, because I spent many years talking about men's spaces that are dominated by men and how they are more suited to men's needs, like certain industries where 80% of board directors are men, so therefore the companies are probably more suitable to men, which I understand. But then we would never talk about the opposite, where therapeutic models or therapists are mostly women. So surely that's going to create systems and frameworks that are more suitable for women. And the sad facts are things like 91% of men who died by suicide in some studies had sought help, and they still took their own life. So if you're looking at suicidal men and more than 9 in 10 of them took their own life, then surely the problem is the help didn't work. Like, 91% of them sought help and then killed themselves. So the idea that you then point at the men as a problem, when they turned up, or at least 91% of them turned up, and they weren't saved, surely the finger should, at least in part, be pointed back at ourselves for failing to give them the appropriate care. And we're just not ready for that conversation, because that requires accountability on our behalf, meaning society, and that's just not something that we're ready for, unfortunately.
Wow. I mean, that is heavy. I work at a addiction rehab, a men's addiction rehab, and so that's kind of my world that I'm in. And it seems like there's this burden that's placed on men to behave a certain way, take all this kind of responsibility on yourself, and don't complain about it because you have all the privilege. And I see so many men like just kind of take that and swallow it, and they feel this need to drown that out with alcohol and drugs because like I can't handle all this burden.
That's the sad thing about addiction, is that it's often a coping mechanism for something else. And not only does it not work because it doesn't solve the problem, but it actually makes it worse. That the thing that you think is a coping mechanism is actually exacerbating the problem. And then it doesn't necessarily have to be drugs, so things like gambling. Like, I was shocked to find that 400 suicides in the UK are caused by gambling every single year. 400. I was like, why is no one talking about that? And gambling is everywhere. You see it on like the front of, like, half of our Premier League football clubs have a gambling sponsor on the front of their shirt. And obviously it's mostly men watching football, and it's almost exclusively men who die by suicide as a result of gambling addiction. No one's ready to talk about that. And I wish do you ever meet people with gambling addictions in your work?
I have. It's really sad. It's, I feel like, I mean, you see people who, I mean, gamble away a family business or gamble away the home. And, I
Hmm.
think for some reason, it seems like the level of shame and defeatedness it's just on a different level, even compared to drugs, which has a lot of shame attached to it. But
Mm.
just, gambling away the family home or family business. I mean, just these people, just a level of defeatedness is hard to rival.
Yeah, and that's why I guess it causes so many suicides, and that's why I'm trying to encourage people to see suicide not primarily as a mental health problem, but as a structural external problem. That's sort of the culmination of various different things that put men into a position where suicide, it seems to be the only way out. It's like I've seen it described as a solution-based outcome
Mm.
for men. And these men are living with real problems. They're not mentally unwell. They're living with things like gambling addictions or joblessness or debt or some sort of relationship breakdowns, a big one, particularly child custody battles, often experiences of abuse or sexual violence in sort of childhood, like so many different things. Like my friend Susie Bennett describes suicide as an orchestra of pain. And like any orchestra, you don't say that's the violinist or that's the trombonist. It's all of the instruments playing at all the same time to create one singular symphony. So obviously, male suicide is again the common denominator in many ways too, in what I talk about. And if you actually talk to the men who are suicidal, you'll realize that they're not mentally unwell. They're not responding in a way that is unusual when you understand the circumstances of their life. Like one of them, I think about 1 in 5 suicides in the UK is tied to child
Mm.
custody battles. And I mean, I'm not a parent, but I can imagine child custody battle, coming to terms of losing a child in a divorce, not to mention your home, your relationship, family, maybe even like your job. I can understand why a man in that situation wouldn't want to be here anymore. I don't think it's right to say, oh, well, he's mentally unwell. I'm like, this guy is losing the most important thing in his life. So I can understand like, why he might be put in that position. And I feel like you're gaslighting men by telling it you're mentally unwell. I'm like, he's actually responding in a very
It
understandable way.
it kind of goes
So,
back to me
yeah.
to this. You kind of hear this stereotype of how men and women process things differently. And the old joke is a woman has a problem and the man comes in and like, okay, let's solve it. And she's like, I don't want you to solve it. I just want you to hear me talk about the problem. I just want to process. And that idea of like just processing the problem is a very like feminized therapy like technique of how we do things. And a lot of what you're describing for men's issues, like, no, I need money to pay my mortgage. I need to see my kids that I lost in a custody battle. I need a solution. Like,
Mhm.
I know very well what the problem is. Like, I don't need you to tell me what the problem is. Like, I need some kind of solution. And to like sit men
Yeah.
down and like, let's just keep rehashing the problem. That doesn't make sense to us a lot of times.
I mean, it might even make it worse. I did a podcast last week, and the guy was like, "Well, isn't this in many ways men's fault?" Like he was saying, like, "Well, we need to like bootstrap our way out of this, and like you need to, you know, get yourself off the sofa and sort." And I was like, yeah, "If a man is losing his child in family court, the system is broken. No amount of bootstrapping is going to bring that man's child back. That man's child is brought back when we look at the system and we investigate what's happening in family courts." And we change that, and blaming him and telling him to, toughen up is not only not going to solve the problem, it could make it worse because then you're bringing that sense of failure and shame to the situation too. Yeah, you're very right. I mean, it's like the men are from Mars and women are from Venus situation where women often want to be heard and men often want a solution. So then you end up with this hypothetical husband and wife where he's offering solutions, whereas she just wants to be heard, and neither of them are listening to one or another. Yes, I don't want to say it's always that clean cut because sometimes men want to be heard and sometimes women want solutions. So I'd always say if someone comes to you looking for this conversation, sometimes it's just good to be like, well, do you want a solution or do you just want me to listen? No, just ask them. And then you're at least clear. Because I wouldn't say it's all men want solutions and all women just want to be heard because there's obviously an overlap. But generally speaking, I think you're right. Yeah.
Mm, wow. So one of the things that you hear, I don't know how much pushback you get from certain segments of feminists, but one of the things I hear is like it doesn't make sense to talk about men's issues because men have always had all the power in society. Men have privilege. There's no reason for you to complain because you're holding all the cards. Do you get that?
Yeah. It's just like you're living in a cartoon world. And I get it. You will look at the fact that every single president of America has been a man, or maybe 2/3, 3/4 of politicians are male. But I get it. That's fair enough. But that isn't the same as saying men are systemically privileged as a group. Just because men are writing the laws, and they often are, doesn't mean the laws are being written for men. If anything, the gender laws are more often written for women. So what I mean by that is men's health in America, one example. If I were to write down all 15 of the top causes of death for you, men are leading in 13 of those causes. Men's health in America is worse than women's across every single group. Like racial group, ethnic group, socioeconomic group is worse. They die more every single age. They live less life in every single country. Just to simply be a male, you are now part of the single greatest demographic factor predicting early death. And to quote Professor Randolph Neese, he said, if you could equalize those male and female mortality rates, you'd do more good than curing cancer. So that gives you a sense of perspective of how big of a problem men's health is in America. However, there are 10 offices, federal offices, tax funded for women's health in America, various different ones. And I support all of them. But there are 0 for men, not one single office. And every attempt to create an office for men's health has ended the same way, failure. So I understand that if we live in this patriarchy, surely it'd be the opposite way around, where there'd be 10 offices for men's health and none for women. But that isn't the case. And the fact of the matter is, like I said, like, yes, those in power are often men, but that doesn't mean they're exercising that power to help other men, because clearly they aren't. So this idea of a patriarchy is so low resolution and divisive and unhelpful and increasingly wrong. Think about boys in education. Like, they're further behind than women were 50 years ago, and we do nothing. You would have thought patriarchy would make that number one priority. They'd be on that day one. But it's been 3 decades, nearly 4 decades. Nothing's changed. So I refute that theory, obviously. And I think there are new, more progressive, higher resolution, evidence-based, non-political worldviews that we desperately need to use, because it's not taking us anywhere.
It seems like if you look at historically, I mean, the feminist argument for patriarchy is that men have controlled everything. But historically, it seems like, obviously there was like a king or whoever the patriarch was that had a huge amount of power. But the average man didn't have a lot of power. They were a lot of times fodder for wars, whereas the average woman at least
Yeah.
had the amount of value that you're valued for your reproductive capacities, which the men were not. And it seems like we've moved into this era of modernity where we've tried to abandon a lot of those like historic responsibilities and add some privileges on the women's side, and on the men's side we're still kind of blamed for being the oppressor. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, hang on one sec. Maybe can you...
Oh, I lost your audio.
So I'm talking to my girlfriend. One sec. Is that all right? So I'm just sending her away like a patriarch. Go on. Just kind of give me into that question.
Yeah, I mean, just like historically, you had women valued for like reproductive capacity, men a lot of times not valued at all, kind of fodder for wars. But kind of the male role was certain areas of providing, protecting, and it seems like a lot of on the women's side, a lot of the burdens have been cast off, a lot of the privileges have been added. And on the men's side, we're still kind of considered the oppressor, even though that's shifted dramatically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly making less and less sense as time goes on. Like, you're right. If you look at the word patriarchy, it's a combination of father and ruler, or father dominator. It essentially means the father is the ruler of the family. That's what patriarchy means as a word. But if you actually look at fathers and you see the rights they don't have to their own kids, like in the UK, like, it's certainly not equal rights for fathers. In America, I mean, you could argue there's equal rights in a few states, but not nowhere near all of them. I don't understand how, if the father is the ruler, how does he not have the rights to the things that are most important to him, meaning his children? Like, if we're living in a patriarchy, why has generation after generation of men been taken from their homes and used as meat shields in wars, just sent to their death by the millions. Like clearly they're the disposable sex. I don't see why that's a privilege. And although there certainly are privileges to men, especially historically, it's just not a one-way thing. That it's a mixed bag of advantages and disadvantages. But more so, it just seems to be more and more disadvantages for men, and no attempt to really help them at all. Like the conversation of the patriarchy often looks at, who has the most billionaires or CEOs or prime ministers, politicians or presidents, but that they make up such a small percentage of men. Like I don't know any politicians or presidents or billionaires or CEOs, but I do know a lot of men that are really struggling with life. I do know that men's health, which impacts everyone, is something that men are, as a group, are massively disadvantaged by. Like I mentioned, I know in education, like boys are behind at every stage of education, at every level, in more or less every single country in the West, and that just seems like a much more relevant barometer for understanding equality between the genders than comparing who has the most billionaires or how many women presidents there have been. Like, I get it, that's one measure, but it's not relevant to 99.9% of people who are not billionaires or the president of the United States. So deciding how we measure equality in many ways is a privilege in its own right. And that line of equality is often drawn by people that are not men. And it's drawn at the top where men are disproportionately seen. But they're also at the bottom too, like homeless, those with addiction, those dying at work, those ending their own lives. They are mostly men too. So men are disproportionately seen at the top and bottom of society. And yet we only ever look at the top, which is just not fair.
It seems like in the modern world, the rules of the game for how you ascend to the top of the hierarchy, the rules have become more feminized in a sense where, uh, as opposed to like this kind of go-getter mentality, maybe like in the 50s that you might have seen people rising, climbing the corporate ladder. It's very much how much you get along with people, and there's certain types of
Mm.
power that are based on your ability to present a certain level of victimhood. So rather than projecting strength, it's how much can I convince you to feel sorry for me? There's these certain types of
Yeah.
like kind of unwritten social rules that seem to tilt the scale in the balance towards females and away from males. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like
Yeah.
squeaky wheel gets the oil, as they say. And yeah, I thought about that too. I mean, obviously, I think a lot about this, and so much of it does seem to come down to squeaky wheel gets the oil. And we know men are less likely to complain or share experiences, especially painful ones, particularly in like experiences of abuse. And we know men are less likely to talk about these things. Men are less likely to open up, but we don't think about how men's lack of opening up also not only impacts him, but also shapes societal views of sexism. Like we know, going back to abuse, men are 2 or 3 times less likely to tell anyone about their domestic violence experiences. And because data is based on those experiences, like the data is not complete because you're not capturing those unseen victims. So it's not just in domestic violence, it's just the fact that men are less likely to be transparent about these things for many reasons. And yeah, that obviously has a detrimental impact to those men, but it does create a lopsided view of privilege where we don't talk about these things. And those that do talk about them, like myself, you're shadow banned into oblivion or worse. So yeah, it's interesting the systemic impacts of men's inability to talk, but more so society's inability to listen to them.
So we brought up a couple times this idea of men losing their children in custody battles. What can you tell me about that?
Not a huge amount. I mean, every area of advocacy in this space is full of question marks and unanswered questions. And I often on podcasts have to say I don't know the answer to that because no one's asking us questions. Like we don't really know why boys are behind in school. We don't know much about men's health because no one's asking us questions. And family court, they're secret. They're closed. We don't know what's really going on. There's no real oversight. There's no journalists. You can't go in as men with the public. They're unique in the sense that they're secret family courts. They're private. But we do know there was a lot of fathers feeling like they've not been treated fairly. We do know that parental rights in the UK, and if we're getting into nuts and bolts of legislation, that mothers have parental responsibility in every single circumstance. So whether the mum is married, divorced, single, separated, she has full custody to that child, full responsibility. However, the man has to be either married to the mother or named on the birth certificate. If he doesn't have either one of those things, he has no control over that child whatsoever. He has no control over the name, who gets custody, if it goes up for adoption, or what school he or she goes to. So a woman gets full rights to her child in every case, which is the right thing to do. But a man has to be married or named on the birth certificate. And obviously both those things are at the discretion of the mother. Like she could refuse to name him and she could refuse to marry him. So she decides if he has rights to his own child. So then he has to marry into his rights. So that is that's like the reverse of the patriarchy, where women had to be married to a man to be seen as autonomous woman. And I was like, well, that's how it works in reverse for fathers, where they have to marry the mother or be named on the birth certificate. Beyond that, family courts are a black box. We don't really know what's going on, but I would love there to be some sort of investigation to find out. But again, no one wants to do that. And ultimately, the language we're using around father's rights and mother's rights is not right. Like, it's not about what a father or mother is entitled to. Because what matters is a child is entitled to both their parents. That's what we should be talking about. That's what we should be aiming for. And yet we get stuck on this tug of war with the child at the middle, with both parents thinking that they have a right to their child, when that's not what it's about. It's about what the child needs. And often that is both parents.
Wow. What can you tell me, if anything, about paternity fraud?
Wow. Yeah, you're ramping up the controversy.
We might as well at this point.
Paternity fraud is, yeah, I mean, there aren't many levels higher than that. That's like right on the ghost pepper side of the chili scale of spiciness. Paternity fraud basically describes when a man is essentially, a father is raising a child he thinks is his, but is actually not his child. It turns out it's not him. It's a child of another man. He's found out, at birth, or often, sometimes like quite far into the child's life, and he's raised that child. Difficult to know the exact stats. Firstly, because no one's asking that question, and the studies that are quite biased, but around 1 in 25 fathers are raising a child they think is theirs but isn't. So it's about, I don't know, 2 to 5%, maybe. And that's quite a low percentage. But if you scale that up to every father in America, we're talking about millions of dads, millions and millions of dads that are raising a child that isn't theirs, but they think is theirs. And worse, when these men find out that the child's not theirs, they're still compelled often to pay child support.
Even after
someone
the
else's
paternity
child,
test?
for someone else's child. Yeah. So you're paying child custody, having been basically exploited and defrauded yourself for someone else's child. And worse, there are stories of like men, and particularly boys, being raped by women. The woman gets pregnant and he's still compelled to pay child custody for a baby for which he didn't even choose. He's raped. Like, there's like stories of like maybe a 15-year-old boy who was raped by his babysitter, and then maybe 10 or 15 years later he got served with child custody, that paper, like she wanted child, and he had to pay it. And it was weird because it went to court and she was found guilty of raping him in a criminal court, but because that was a civil court, it didn't interact, so they couldn't throw out the the child support claim because it was a different system. So that shows how crazy it is. It's like young boys as well getting served papers. So yes, that's obviously quite rare, but fathers raising children that aren't theirs is more common than you think. You see it on like those TV shows which are just horrendous, like broadcasting the most heartbreaking moment of a man's life, where you are not the father. I need to see his face just break down. And we see it as more deserving of reality TV than we do justice and grown-up conversation. So, I mean, there aren't many things worse than finding out the child you've cared for and loved is not your child. And it's very common. But It's just very difficult. There's a lot of uncertainty around that number. Some people say it's higher. Some people say like, oh well, half of people getting paternity tests are not the dad, so 50%. But what you've got to understand of that is that those people already have
Selection bias.
suspicions, which is why they're getting a test. Yes, exactly. But then there's selection bias in the opposite way, where a mother that knows the child is not the dad, she's not going to go on to a study where he's going to find out the truth. Like there's a selection bias on both sides. So with all things, there's a large margin of error, but I think 1 in 25 is probably the best guess. But we're still talking about millions of dads.
It's just heartbreaking. It's just, I
Mhm.
mean, I've heard stories of men like in their 50s or something where they're beyond time where they could have more kids, really, and then find out their three kids are not their own. It's like their whole life is ripped away from them in a moment. Everything that they knew about
Mm.
themselves and what they're passing on into the future with the next generation, it's been robbed from them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I just can't begin to think how upsetting it would be. And I know, like, in France, there's been a law put in recently that's made paternity tests illegal.
What?
So a father can't even, yeah, he can't do it. It's against, like, against the mother's human rights. So I guess he could have done his own paternity test and paid for it himself and done it privately, but that's now not allowed, illegal. And I think this is very difficult. And I don't get why it shouldn't be part of just routine checks when a baby's born. Like babies are tested for many different things when they're born. I don't see why we can't just normalize it as part of that process. Like obviously just do a DNA test, and you want to know who the baby belongs to for many reasons around like genetic, hereditary problems. Like you want to know who the dad is for the health of the baby, but also obviously for the dad. So obviously that suggestion is very unpopular because people think you're treating women as, liars. But there are a lot of women that
Yeah.
are lying. There's a lot of women that are like you said, like 1 in 25. Like most women, most mothers, of course not. Vast majority of women would be horrified by what we're talking about, but not all of them.
It's wild because if you were to say some men lie, no one would question that. But to say some women lie, why are you attacking women? There's such a double standard where it's hard to even like begin these conversations.
Yeah, and then if you want to dial up the spiciness level even more, talk about women that lie about accusations of rape, lie about being raped. Like we're talking about 8% of accusations probably are made up. But again, massive margin of error on that one. But 8% is probably the best guess. And that's just an enormous number. And like false accusations ruin lives, completely destroy. Like I know people that have ended their life as being falsely accused. I know mothers whose sons have killed themselves because they were falsely accused, found innocent. They weren't innocent in the court of public opinion. Lives were ruined and they killed themselves. So it's so annoying when I see that talked about online and being falsely accused is compared to some sort of freak event like being struck by lightning. Well, you've
Yeah.
got more chance. You're twice as likely to be hit by lightning than you are to be falsely accused. And I'm like, well, I've never met a mum who's lost her son to being struck by
Yeah.
lightning. I've never met someone ever been struck by lightning, but I know a lot of people who have been falsely accused. And people are, well, why would women do that? I'm like, well, because some women are arseholes. Like some men are. Like, why would a man beat his wife? Because he's a piece of shit.
Yeah.
Like, they're not all fucking great. Like, part of women's autonomy is recognizing that women do good and bad things. They're not
Yeah.
all saints. They're human beings. They're capable of both criminal and saintly behavior. Like, that's what autonomy is. Some of them do horrific things. Some of them lie. And like, why? And also tying that back into child custody. Think about if you're fighting for your child in family court as a woman, and if you make an accusation of sexual abuse, particularly child abuse, that is going to be a big tick for you. That will probably close the case on its own. You don't have to provide much evidence. Suddenly there's an accusation of child abuse. That also means you get legal aid, so all of your legal expenses are paid for. And it's particularly prevalent in working class families where they can't afford to go to pay the bills in any other way. Accusation is made, and that's the trial over. So the incentives are there. And I think any parent fighting for their child, it must cross their mind to be like, if I'd have said this thing, yeah, you'd probably win me the child. So it's obviously very controversial. And I'm not saying some people some people say, well, only 6% of cases of rape are found guilty, which must mean 94% are lying. That's obviously not true either. So what we know is about 8% of allegations are provably false, and about 6% of allegations are provably true. So the line of truth is somewhere between that massive margin of error. And I don't know where you draw it, obviously towards the lower end, in my opinion, but it's certainly not like being struck by lightning, I'll tell you that much.
I don't know what the Me Too movement was like in the UK, but in the US, it seemed so disingenuous because at the beginning, it was like, believe all women, period, end of story. And it was like, if a Republican like Brett Kavanaugh was accused of something, believe women, period. There's no other story. And if a Democrat, Joe Biden, was accused of similar sexual misconduct, oh, now we need to, pay attention to details. That it seemed like a very, just like a fraudulent claim. Did it seem like a political football to kick around to you?
Yeah, I mean, and then what happens when a woman's accused? Exactly. Who the hell do you believe then? They're both women. And the woman that popularized that term, whose name I can't remember, but she's like quite a well-known black activist. She completely hates that concept. She's like, we should not just be believing women, especially as a black woman. Like, we know in black communities what happens to particularly black men when they're accused of doing certain things they didn't do. Like Emmett Till's accuser only recently died. We didn't fucking believe her because she made it up. So it's dangerous just to believe someone on the basis of their sex. And you have like weird double standards where Rose McGowan, obviously one of the pioneers of Me Too, she was just like, men knew what they're doing. It says men, 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 until her friend, Asia Argento, who is a woman, was accused of raping a boy. And then Rose McGowan was suddenly like, right, let's calm down. Let's wait to hear her side of the story. Like, what happened to that? What happened to the whole belief thing? And Asia Argento got to pay off the boy and then just disappeared into the wilderness and got away with it, essentially, because she's a woman. And yeah, like I read the stories of Harvey Weinstein, and I'm glad he got some sort of justice, but to paint it as a very binary thing is not right either. And you see it when a woman accuses another woman, or when a boy accuses a woman. So I would say I believe every accusation should be taken seriously. I believe everyone deserves justice, but victims are on both sides. It's not just the person making the accusation that is often a victim, but the person being accused can also be a victim of being falsely accused. So there was no soundbite ultimately that can capture the nuance of sexual violence. So any attempt to create a soundbite is immediately flawed. But yeah, Me Too. I mean, we didn't get it in England, and I think I was a bit too young for it anyway. But it does seem to have created quite a hostile environment around allegations that's quite rigid, particularly around believing women. And yeah, I mean, obviously you got that Amber Heard as well, who was just obviously an abuser. And she provided zero evidence of physical abuse or sexual abuse by Johnny Depp, whereas he had real evidence, like recordings, hospital evidence, like injuries, witnesses, and a lot of people still don't believe him. And they still believe her. Like she is on tape saying, like literally admitting to beating him up, and people still defend her. Like we had I think 200 feminist charities sign an open letter supporting Amber Heard, including people like Gloria Steinem and like Women's Aid and Refuge UK, like massive organisations, the Women's March. So you got the feminist sector writing an open letter in support of an abuser just because she's a woman. So that is the situation we found ourselves in, and it's a complete mess. And yeah, kind of hopeless in
Yeah,
many ways.
that domestic violence issue is a really interesting one because even before hearing any facts, the basic assumption is the woman's the victim, the man's the perpetrator. The woman has a higher moral standing, and thus we should trust her voice more. Like these are all before we even start to look at it. This is kind of like a lot of our assumptions just going into it.
Well, there's a big overlap as well. Like even the assumption that domestic violence splits neatly into victim and perpetrator is wrong. Because I mean, if I were to draw your pie chart in the air right now of victims of abuse, half of that pie chart would be what's called bilateral abuse or reciprocal abuse, where both partners are feeding into what's called a cycle of violence. So both the female and male partner are abusing each other and both victims. They're simultaneously victims and perpetrators. So that's half of all abuse straight away. And then of the other half, which is called non-reciprocal abuse or unilateral abuse, where it is just one partner, women are the perpetrators 70% of the time. And then 30% is men.
Wait,
So this
say that
idea
again.
of
In unilateral abuse, where there's one abuser, 70% of those are women?
Yeah. It's a massive studies by Daniel Whitaker that's found that. We're talking like tens of thousands of relationships studied. Half was bilateral abuse, so both partners. Of the other half, 70% of that, 35% overall, was women only. And then 30% of that half, or 15% overall, was male only. And then of that 15%, 1/3 of that was considered severe, meaning it's resulted in injury or hospitalization. So 5% of all abuse is what you see on the media, where it's severe male-only violence, 5%, and the rest of it is other things, mostly bilateral. So this idea of male violence, that is the third most common form of domestic abuse or intimate partner violence. The most common, bilateral, then it's female violence, and then it's male violence. And then only 1/3 of that male violence is severe. The rest of it's sort of pushing and shoving, which is still important to talk about, but it's not, what you see on the news where it's like a man punching or hitting his wife. So it's better to talk about a cycle of violence, really, and the priority should be breaking it so it doesn't escalate. But we don't. We do the same thing like what I said of the billionaires, where we talk about women that are killed by men, by their male partners, which is mostly women being killed by men, although about 1 in 4 partners is a man who's killed. But that is such a small percentage of all domestic violence. I think it's like 0.02% of all intimate partner violence ends in a death. And we shouldn't be looking at that as some sort of barometer for all partner violence. So what I'm trying to do is dial up the resolution a little bit, as uncomfortable as it might feel, and introduce people to a bit of nuance and evidence-based data, rather than just sloganeering catchphrases and politics and virtue signaling. And obviously that's where it becomes very unpopular. Like talking about male victims of abuse is unpopular. Talking about male victims of women, that's why you have to hide your second name.
Yeah.
It's just like,
Wow.
It's crazy.
I mean, I think there's a number of people that would say by you saying that women have some culpability in domestic violence, that's victim blaming.
Well, those people are stupid. Like no, I don't. I think violent women are victims often in their own right. Like they are either actual victims in terms of they're recipients of bilateral violence, or even if they're just unilaterally violent, they deserve help too. Like everyone talks about the damage this gendered model of domestic violence does to male victims, and it certainly does. Like there is virtually no help for men in America. I think there's about 2 refuges I hear in all of North America for men, 2, and then many thousands for women. So that obviously is creating great harm. But also, no one really talks about the harm done to violent women who could be helped through treatment, but are not treated because they also fall through the cracks of this gendered model of violence, because we don't see the male victim, but we also don't see the female perpetrator. So it doesn't help anyone. And then you obviously look at like same-sex relationships with women where no one gets any help because they're both excluded. And often, a lot of data finds that lesbian relationships have the highest rates of violence. Either lesbian relationships or bisexual women have the highest rates. So as a crude formula, it seems like the fewer the men, the lesser the violence. And like gay men have quite notoriously low rates of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. So again, that is very antithetical to what we're told. And yeah, it's just very unpopular. And like I know I interviewed the woman that set up the first refuge in the world for women called Erin Pitsey. And she set up the first refuge. She set up the oldest and largest domestic violence charity in the world. She wrote the first book on domestic violence. She squatted in hundreds of buildings all over the UK to essentially rescue women. Like no one has done more for women, in my opinion. She said herself, like most of the women coming to her were violent themselves. She tried to set up a shelter for men and boys. And as soon as she stepped outside of the gendered narrative and started talking about what's called interactive violence, the cycle of violence, cancelled. Like, we're talking like bomb threats, death threats. She had a police escort. Like, her life was ruined. She became like a shadow of the domestic violence industry. And that all too often that happens to academics and advocates who talk about male victims, particularly by women. And obviously that's a massive part of the problem as well.
So we've had a good conversation so far. I'm wondering, when you look at like this, the area of men's issues, specifically men's mental health, what's going on with men, what's a solution that you can give to us going forward for how we can better approach men's well-being?
I mean, the elephant in the room is that a lot of the things I've talked about are uncomfortable and will prickle to hear. And if you're still listening to this podcast and haven't turned off as a result, give yourself some credit. Like, it is uncomfortable, it is ugly, it is hard to hear. But no amount of discomfort is more important than another man's life. Like, to hear about the 50 million men who are abused in their lifetime in America is a statistical fact, but also uncomfortable. 11% of men who are abused will consider suicide. 11% of 50 million is a huge number that are left vulnerable to suicide. So if we are really going to talk about preventing male suicide, we need to think about what are the associated factors that push men towards making that decision. A lot of them are victims of domestic violence. Things like sexual violence against boys will increase that boy's instance of attempting suicide by 10 from experience of sexual violence. We've got to talk about family courts. We've got to talk about child custody. We've got to talk about joblessness. We've got to talk about male loneliness in a real, meaningful, evidence-based, non-divisive way. And as difficult as that is, and I know how difficult it is because obviously I've been doing it for a long time, we have to do it. Because if we don't, no one else will. And as difficult as it is to talk about male victims of abuse, it is nothing in comparison to being an actual male victim of abuse. Like, talking about family courts is painful and upsetting, but it's not as upsetting as losing a child. So we need to remind ourselves that the consequence of not having these conversations in good faith is enormous. And men will continue to end their lives in record-breaking numbers as they already are. We've just had the worst data this century in the UK. Until we start to look at male suicide as something else other than a mental health crisis, which it is not primarily. So I guess I'd leave you the message that if you're still here, thank you. And acknowledging that these conversations are very difficult, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't have them. So yeah, try and take that forward and try and have these conversations in your own life, if possible.
So, George, my final question for you is, when you look at society more broadly, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
Just the one. I think the war, in Europe, the war in Ukraine, I think is pretty horrendous. Like, I get sent videos of men literally being dragged off the street and stuffed into vans and sent to the war, like, because of the draft, or like taken from their homes or taken from their cars or at work. And like, that war is still going and causing so much devastation. And it's mostly overwhelmingly men who are obviously on the front lines fighting it. And I've got to talk about, I haven't talked about circumcision in America. And that is obviously an interesting one for those on the right. And I do not understand why circumcision is not part of the conversation the right are having around things like trans-affirming surgery on minors. Like, I don't believe children should be having any sort of surgery done on their genitals unless it's absolutely medically necessary. And that has to include circumcision, which the vast majority is not medically necessary. And it's horrendously painful. And how it's not comparable to trans-affirming surgery is the scale. We're talking millions of boys taken from their parents in the first few days of life and given excruciatingly painful surgeries without any need, without any anesthesia, and we just look the other way. So that's one of the things I think we'll look back at and be like, I can't believe we did that. And I understand there's religious reasons for it, cultural reasons, but none of them are more important than human rights. None of religious reasons supersede human rights. So every child has the right to bodily integrity. I hear that a lot in the area of trans-affirming surgery or against it. And I just wish we would remind ourselves of that within circumcision. So yeah, infant male circumcision and the war in Ukraine are two topics I think we should talk about more.
That's good stuff. Well, George, this was a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for listening.